All right, good afternoon. So that was a pretty good summary of where I'm coming from. So just to kind of situate that disciplinary interest, I really am from the world of narrative games, and particularly a field called platform studies. And the idea of platform studies is we're kind of interested in technology all the way up to the level of the audience and all the way down to the level of the hardware and manufacturing process. And for me, this is really important because when we're thinking about digital storytelling, we can never separate it from the platforms and the institutions that have created it. And when those platforms and institutions are grounded in rhetorics that marginalize many voices, the end results tends to be similarly marginalizing, which is part of why, though I am associated with game studies, I have a lot of trouble playing or caring about AAA video games. And when we use the category AAA within the world of games, what we're really talking about is kind of the mainstream industry, which is dominated by white men. And it fetishizes a lot of very dangerous practices, including crunch time, which is pretty much designed to make it so that anyone who participates in the game industry has difficulty maintaining relationships outside of their business. And just the entire culture that goes into AAA games is very exhausting. So thus, it might seem strange to you that I'm coming up here to say that I believe games are the future of digital storytelling, and that bringing the lenses and techniques of digital storytelling into interactive spaces can be a really important way to amplify voices that we don't otherwise hear, which is, of course, not the impression, perhaps, that the AAA games industry would give of this medium. So, to inevitably contextualize this, of course, I'm not the only person from the world of game studies who's having a lot of difficulty with where video games are right now, particularly in the context of a world where if you look at the best-selling interactive digital media project from last year, it was Call of Duty: Infinite Warfare. And the greatest challenge these types of games represent to those of us who want to think about games as a medium for digital storytelling is that they ultimately not only reinforce and magnify social norms, but they encourage players to literally look through the world down the barrel of a gun. And, well, we in game studies have really moved beyond and constantly critiqued the claim that games are a contributor to violence, which is the same sort of moral panic that tends to accompany anything teenagers like ever. We cannot so easily and simply dismiss the idea that these games do not contain within them messages. Indeed, as Ian Bogost in his eternally cited inescapable writing on games has posited, video games can and do make claims about the world. And the question of who is making those claims, whose claims we hear and amplify in the world of games, and what verbs of interaction games allow and prioritize is crucial to having games that can potentially change people's minds and engage in meaningful and persuasive procedural rhetoric that is not in a default of violence, which really remains the norm. This, of course, is a screenshot from one of the formative games of my youth. Many, many hundreds of hours spent playing Doom and Doom 2. No? Nobody? Excellent. Which did not, I don't think, in fact, do me any harm. But it did continually bother me that the only way I could relate to any character within that game world was by shooting it. That there was, in fact, no other verb of interaction. And ultimately, narrative games and the potential of digital storytelling in games is to forefront the verb, to make us think about the different verbs available to us and how we interact with the world, and to explore options and consequences of these types of interactions outside the default verbs of game mechanics that still dominate much of the industry. So for this, I turn historically to the classic point-and-click world of adventure games, which were so particularly fantastic for the way that they put the verbs in which you could explore a world on the screen. Anyone recognize this? I'm old. All right, so these are the verbs from Day of the Tentacle, a truly fantastically weird adventure game. And you can get a sense without seeing any of the rest of the game world or characters of the types of interactions you're able to have in this game. You can give, you can open, close, look at, pick up, use, push, pull, and most importantly, talk to people. So this set of verbs is notable both for what it includes and what it does not include. And this is the legacy and tradition of narrative games that I believe is most valuable to us in digital storytelling and has the most potential to resist the mainstream narratives of AAA gaming. So when we think about what makes video games different from the other forms of digital storytelling, we're talking a definition that I would like to advance is that video games are a conversation enabled by a procedural system. This sounds complicated, perhaps if you're not familiar with kind of procedural systems as code for, well, code. But what we're really saying is that games have rules that represent things that a designer has already intentionally placed within that world. And you as a player get to go in and interact in accordance with the rules that that person has programmed and get responses back to your interactions. So video games are a form of digital storytelling you can prod at and they'll prod back. What makes those conversations so useful for thinking about video games as different from other media is that they allow us to engage with, question, and challenge representations through the types of systems we create and produce. So really, the more of us working to question the dominant paradigms within games, the more interesting systems games can represent and create. A recent book that's a really powerful way to kind of start this conversation, Ready Player 2 by Shira Chess, examines both the assumptions most games make about who plays them and the importance of the rise of Player 2. So if Player 1 is the white, cis, heterosexual, young, able-bodied, middle-class male, Player 2 is the position opened up to everybody else, the afterthought, the player who the system was not really designed to converse with, who often was not imagined when the system was created. And games actually addressed to Player 2 are on the rise in commercial space. And these games do not tend to be about violence or global issues in the same way. They tend to take their start in spaces that are traditionally coded female, particularly in the domestic sphere. This means that kind of Shira Chess's work engages with commercial games like the ubiquitous world of mobile and social games, including everything from playing your way up a celebrity lifestyle with Kim Kardashian to more familiar sim games like Farmville and all the other villes it begot. These types of games are kind of more limited heirs to the traditions of narrative and point-and-click games, and they're a good starting point for what these games can be. But because of their kind of corporate origin point, they often miss the main opportunity I see for narrative games, which is that narrative games have the ability to be intensely personal. What does that mean? Well, Anna Anthropy contended nearly a decade ago now that the future of games could best be found by looking at how, as her title puts it, freaks, normals, amateurs, artists, dreamers, dropouts, queers, housewives, and people like you are taking back an art form. Contending that smaller games with small budgets and small audiences are where we can do things that are bizarre and interesting and subversive. And this contention came just before a storm that those of you who are kind of familiar with the world of games and games culture might remember as Gamergate. I don't want to get caught up in Gamergate here because I think ultimately we do better with this art form by looking forward, but it has played a huge role in the discourse of gaming. It was essentially a conflict driven by an attack by someone's ex-boyfriend on a woman who dared to be visible as a woman on the internet and create games. But it became, in its larger form, a conversation about what games are, and particularly a war of Player 1 against the idea that Player 2 could ever be centered in games as a space. So this question of ownership of games kind of leads me to the idea of making digital narratives as a feminist act. This is a little excerpt from Jeremy Douglas's work in the Critical Code Studies Working Group, which is one of those layers of platform studies that has a tendency to be very dominated by white men. Because in order to engage in critical code studies, which is kind of humanist-informed readings of code, you have to already have a very high level of code literacy. And those who tend to bring that and participate easily in the spaces of technical discourse tend to already be white men. But one of the things that's emerged within critical code studies is an awareness of how code practices and even the practice of learning to code, well, embodied as other within tech communities, can be an act of feminism. And particularly, a lot of the platforms emerging for digital narrative creation embody these types of principles. So I'm going to give you a really brief tour of some of the platforms that I'm talking about in these terms. Some have already come up here. One of my personal favorites, and the one I started on, was Adventure Game Studio. This is a free open source tool that's been around for decades now and evolved over time, but still kind of looks like it belongs on Windows 95. And it's a front-end graphical interface for making graphical adventure games that are, again, all about those verb interfaces. This is RPG Maker. It started really as focused on Japanese 2D role-playing games, but it's been evolved and transformed by all sorts of users into another very interesting subversive narrative game platform with a huge focus on building explorable worlds. Flash, of course, is dead. One of those books mentioned earlier was my collaborative eulogy to Flash, which was so important in the original formation of subversive narrative games because it allowed anyone to distribute their games easily outside the networks of software distribution with immediate access within a browser. Perhaps you remember the days when you could actually play Flash games on anything, pre-iPhone. So while Flash is technically declared dead by its corporate owners, it's still very popular with subversive game designers, and there's a whole legacy of important digital narratives in Flash that many of us now are trying to figure out how we're going to preserve for the future. Now, any archivist interested in a problem, Flash, both an opportunity and a huge problem for all of us in software studies. Then, of course, Twine has already come up in the last panel, and some of you were at my Twine workshop yesterday. There was already one Twine game completed and tweeted out into the world. Well, no game is ever truly complete. That's why we have software versions. So Twine, as I mentioned earlier, it's a platform that was actually created for hypertext by someone I went to grad school with, Chris Clemis. And his goal was to create a very accessible tool where someone who didn't have any background in programming could create something that could be easily distributed and interacted with. And what kind of makes Twine so powerful is that rhetoric surrounding it that you don't need to be familiar with or indoctrinated into the practices of code to develop something that you can easily share on the web and that can be incredibly complex because the ability to represent verbs in language is endless. The ability to represent choices in a text-based game doesn't depend upon your ability to either create or render graphical assets to make something happen. It all comes down to what you can write. And going alongside that, as the genre of the visual novel, this is another of my favorite teaching tools if you are trying to teach kind of a combination of programming and digital storytelling. It's another open source project called RenPy. Anyone played with RenPy? Well, I strongly encourage you to play with RenPy. It's a tool for making visual novels, which is a form that started out with its major popularity in Japan, but has really risen in its subversive potential because of its roots in the romance genre. And thus it has a great appeal for doing relationship-driven fiction. So, these types of games, built with tools that already foreground an open source, potentially feminist and queer philosophy, have the potential to be subversive, and particularly to subvert our expectations of games through offering choices that are not frequently depicted in interactive spaces. Excellent. At least one moment of recognition. Something very weird recently happened on Steam. This game was briefly at the top of the sales. For those of you not familiar with Steam, Steam is in many ways a hyper-masculine space of direct market for purchasing and downloading video games that tends to be dominated by either things put on sale during Steam sales or the latest AAA violent game title. So this, appearing briefly on the screens of all the people who logged on to Steam as the top seller, is pretty awesome and actually a subversive act in itself. It is a visual novel game by a group called Game Grumps, and it's a perfect example of how a genre can be kind of made subversive simply by inclusivity and broadening the sense of what choices are viable. And of course, one of the most important choices within it is from the very moment that you create your character, you have an incredible range of options, including what kind of occasions the most remark immediately, the ability to select various versions of a binder body, which is the only kind of moment where you make the decision to be a trans dad and occupy that character role. It's simply treated like any other physical decision that you're making when designing your character, and it's put alongside a range of options that really forefront body diversity of a type that we pretty much never see in video games. And whatever your character is, however you make this character, your character will be desirable and will be able to enter into lots of relationships with the fine group of dads that occupy this game world. You even start out the game by deciding as a dad the gender identity of your partner in parenting. And of course, your partner is gone to avoid any complications with the romantic paths and entanglements you're about to start on. And throughout the course of the game, you also find out that one of the characters that you can have a relationship with, Damien, otherwise known as the hottest goth dad, is also a trans dad, but the only reference or moment where this is made part of his identity is in making reference to picking out binders as part of picking period-appropriate garb for different occasions. So it's done in a way that, of course, caused lots of commentating immediately after the game was released, and of course, I pulled just one of the social media reactions that made me happy to indicate just what making these sorts of things visible did to invigorate a fan base. Now, these are the sorts of decisions and simulations of inclusion that come from within a commercially intended game. We also have a lot of fascinating discourse of choice and representation happening in these genres within serious games. This is a project by Carly Kusrik and several collaborators that is spurred on by the reproductive health crisis in Texas and focuses on offering you a range of identities to embody a range of circumstances, challenges, to make a decision about your reproductive future, to try to seek an abortion, and then to navigate all of the challenges that Texas's system will put in front of you in making that decision. Similarly, this type of theme has powered a lot of very personal games, including this one, which came out of a game jam that's really inspired by the election called Resist Jam. All of the games within this jam focused on some of the different consequences that people were feeling as a result of Trump's election, and I'm making those consequences and challenges more visible through gameplay. Frequently in these games, what matters isn't the verb that's available, but the verbs that you can't access. The restrictions on choice, particularly restrictions that are based upon the body you occupy, how people treat you, what a legal system will allow in the case of Texas, all of those sorts of restrictions, limitations, and dangers are essential part of the types of personal digital storytelling that are emerging right now. The game that in many ways sparked Gamergate, Depression Quest, sadly became mostly famous as part of Gamergate, but really deserves our attention as a very powerful example of digital narratives in itself. This is Zoe Quinn and collaborators, and it is a simulation of living with clinical depression. And the most powerful aspects of this game come from the choices it won't let you make. So this is built in Twine. And throughout it, you can see the healthy choice in a situation, healthy choices for your relationship, getting your homework done. They're all visible on the screen, but you can't click on them unless you've gotten to a certain level of therapy, family support, and medication that actually lets you start accessing any of the positive choices. And it really was designed not for players with depression, but for family members and friends who are trying to understand clinical depression and are trying to understand how you could know the thing that you're supposed to do but not be able to do it. And it's a very frustrating game to play, which really challenges what a lot of people think of when they think of games. These games are not positive, they're not happy, they're a conversation. Another game in a similar genre built in Twine is called Everything You Swallow Will One Day Come Up Like a Stone. This game is by Porpentine, who's really one of the most powerful voices working in games today and works particularly in Twine. I recommend everything she's done as examples and as things to share with your students and just for a really depressing good time. This game was released for 24 hours. It's a game about suicide. After it was the end of the 24 hours, she deleted the game files from both where she had hosted it and from her own file system, and said that the future of the game was up to the people who had decided whether or not to preserve it. It lives on in a few mirrors now, but it cannot be found in its original URL of distribution. So it was a game both designed to challenge and whose content lived on in the metaphor of its very creation and short lifespan as a release. Again, this is a game that is primarily text. The decisions are very limited, but the impact of a game of this kind, especially under the terms it was released for those of us who discovered it in that moment, and for people who've tried to discover it afterwards, was very powerful through both the procedural rhetoric embedded in the play and the rhetoric of its release and disappearance. This type of personal game is a reminder that many of these game experiences cannot be won. Game designers often come to something thinking about the winning condition. And you'll notice that when I've described and defined games today, I've never talked about winning or a winning condition or a conflict in those terms. Because when we look at digital interactive narratives, which are games, yes, but sometimes divorcing them from the word games can help us realize the ways in which they are not our expectations of games. We frequently are dealing with things that simply cannot be won. The most powerful example of this in my play experience was That Dragon Cancer. Has anyone played this? Warning, this is a game that, at least for me, I found it just broke my heart completely. This is not an easy game to play. This is a game made by a father about the slow death of his child from cancer. It is inspired by his own realization as he was living through the situation that nothing he could do could make this situation better, could change the outcome. I said, and he was already a game designer, so we already had this framework for seeing the world. And I said, this is like a game where the mechanics are subverted and don't work, and nothing works. And I've shown this game to many students who've come into games from a very kind of AAA trained mindset, and they get very frustrated. They say to me, I just kept trying to do all the things that you're supposed to do to calm the kid, and nothing worked. I was like, yes, absolutely. You also cannot cure a child's cancer. The game was actually started while the child was still alive. And the the outcome of the game, well, inevitable, was not known truly by the designer until sometime into its development. And the just different design choices in taking the personal and making it playable are a truly powerful testament to what this type of game can accomplish. Ultimately, games of this kind I would characterize as an act of resistance. Designing interactive stories that break with our expectations, that refuse to give us easy narratives, that resist the very idea that certain situations are winnable, that reject the rules of mainstream gaming, can be very powerful. Prior to the election, a game that embodies this type of resistance was released called We Become What We Behold. This game is played entirely by taking snapshots as a town goes through various levels of metaphor for racial violence. And the more you capture images of this conflict, isolated though it is, suggesting that there's a tension between the squares and the circles, the more you feed into creating fear that then in turn spawns horrific violence that is the inevitable outcome of this game. Once you have, as the controller of the media within this little simulated town, fed them so many images that reinforce fear that there's nothing left. And throughout, you can try to take pictures of other things. You can try to take pictures of the happy relationships. You can try to take pictures of flowers that show up. But the only thing that you can actually succeed in marketing in the end is violence and distrust. And the game actually, this is a screenshot from within the game. So it fans out and makes its meta level known, and ultimately ends with the memorial for all the squares and circles killed in the game's inevitable outcome. Similarly, games after the election have tried to grapple with telling kind of personal stories of feelings of fear and isolation, and also of finding resilience and connection among the game-making community. Many of you might be familiar with the cartoon version of This Is Fine that has spawned so much internet culture and variance at this point that you can't escape the poor dog with his coffee. This is a playable version of that narrative that, as you gradually play through it, all of the other different animal characters come in, and you end up making the best out of sitting in your house that is on fire with your friends, toasting marshmallows in the flames of civilization in a village where everything else is also on fire. After the game's release, the creator just said, basically, this is a metaphor for how myself and my friends were feeling after the election night. A game created as catharsis and shared within these communities. My own recent work has similarly been playing with engaging with digital narratives that come from these sorts of very personal places. This is a collaborative project of mine. Actually, it started in Twine, and then I ended up making it all procedural because that's what us overly code-minded people do. It's set entirely between the night of the election and the night of inauguration, and pulls real tweets from our timeline and incidents from our shared experiences, offering at each point the simple choice of whether to engage on social media with the ongoing discourse or to refuse and try to just go into escapist practices. Spoiler alert, whichever one of those things you do, if you ever engage in any political discourse during this time and your follower number hits a certain point, you will eventually be attracted by a mob of procedurally generated trolls. Writing the algorithms for that was one of the more fun research moments of my life. I pulled from Twitter, pulled fragments of speech, recombined it. So if you ever go play it, you'll see what a procedurally generated attempt at a tweet storm looks like, at least from my view, working with my collaborator, Bridget Blodgett, who not coincidentally is my co-author on the Toxic Geek Masculinity in Media book. So as we engage in these sorts of practices and think about what a playable version of these moments does that a straightforward narrative can't do, I encourage you to think about the ways that interacting with and conversing back gives us an opportunity to challenge any easy narratives that might be applied to the stories we want to share. And ultimately consider how games offer us an opportunity to resist both the linearity of how some traditional stories are told as if their outcome is inevitable, and the assumptions of a mainstream gaming world that often makes no space for player 2 and beyond. Thank you. So most games use verbs in pretty typical ways. They use them to reconstruct capitalist and military-industrial complex norms and assumptions in ways that are exhaustingly familiar. Within actual kind of commercial games that have more of a subversive tendency, one that I find particularly striking is the Professor Layton series. It started on DS, and now there's a version of it on iOS, which makes it a bit more accessible. And the latest game actually features Professor Layton's daughter instead of the ubiquitous Professor Layton of the previous games. And in that world, all of your interactions are kind of governed by this idea of any conversation becomes a puzzle. And these puzzles seem isolated from the narrative in ways that are really weird. Like you could dismiss the whole thing as like a brain age training game experiment. But what it suggests about kind of community relationships and the idea of the value of kind of intellectual sharing is really interesting. And it takes the kind of the normal interactions you're expecting and always puts an additional barrier in front of them. So that's one I really like right now. There's also a whole tradition of flash metagames that take the classic verbs with which you interact with platformers and then twist them around. A good example of that is In the Company of Myself. And that game, if you look at it, you're going to think this doesn't have any verbs at all, but it's a narrated metagame experience where you go through and you think you're trying to accomplish one thing, and it turns out that you're trying to escape something much darker and more depressing. That's all I'll say about it, because that's a really easy one to find and play.
Thinking about verbs in games, how does that work with something like survival horror games, where you're not shooting or actively doing, you're running away?
And that's exactly the verb through which most survival games are dominated. Usually there's 3 in a survival horror. You run, you hide, you collect. And the most interesting survival horror games to me are the ones that then add the ability to create relationships and connections within that and think about whether there's kind of a community to survive with. Good example, the Walking Dead Telltale games, they're not perfect, but they do offer kind of an interesting extension of the ways you might interact within a survival horror game that's not as commonly made part of that genre. And the Telltale games in general are interesting. They're heirs to the point-and-click adventure games. So they capitalize now on a lot of popular media franchises. So.
Question on verb. This is from a total non-coder, so maybe a stupid question. But how are verbs coded? Are they coded by effects on objects and environment? I mean, is it sort of an empty function that only is seen through its effects and throughout the screen of view?
So it varies in every tool. In Twine, a verb is coded very simply by taking a thing and making it link to an outcome. What's nice about that is the system never has to understand what you mean by an action, which really helps when you're programming, kind of, because there you're operating at a level where you have to know how the connection and the computer just has to know that they're linked. When you're in a more complex graphical environment, then the physical effects of a verb have to be realized in some way. And depending upon the tool, that can be either easy to do or difficult to do. The challenge in a lot of engines is that the verbs that are made easiest to create for are always focused on combat and destruction. So like, if I were to suddenly start a Unity tutorial right now, the easiest thing for me to teach you how to create would be a first-person shooter game, because that's so encoded into that. That's the easiest interaction with the world for me to show you how to build. So tools that think about other verbs and make it really easy to create things, like both Adventure Game Studio and RenPy have really robust conversation systems. So they make talking to something that you can just type things in and have it happen without knowing how it works. So they change the defaults for gaming and what you can make by changing what's easy to make.
So like Persuade is going to require a more complex coding system.
Exactly. And the moment you enter into graphics and you have to realize a verb graphically, that's where it does become much more restrictive, which is why personal games tend to use either very simple graphical engines or text-based engines.
You mentioned and have written about a couple of different game development tools that have like really picked up or gained traction by communities who really good use making subversive games. And it's striking to me that you've kind of been present for the sort of beginning of Flash's Twilight era, as well as the like beginning of the first era for Twine. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about like what makes that traction happen. Like, what's the point at which a community starts to form around a tool and create canonized types of uses, and what kind of things do you wish more developers had in mind to create these types of tools for creators in order to make those possibilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the main thing Flash did right was it encouraged a strong user community, and everything the user community came up with and asked for eventually became part of Flash. When you look at Flash, this is the same thing that eventually makes Flash turn into the unwieldy monstrosity of security problems that we all know and love. But people would think about ways to connect the most basic objects back in the days of Flash to create gameplay patterns, and Flash would add more support. And very cleverly, Adobe never stopped the huge sharing of resources, code samples, and material around the tool. So people who picked up Flash had access to that community. And not every platform has been treated the same way. Things that have more walled gardens or where resources are encouraged to be shared primarily through commercial means, such as, say, Unity, don't encourage the same robustness of a community conversation. And also inviting in those users constantly to become part of the development of the platform played a huge role in making Flash kind of continue to appeal to its creators. When we look at Twine, Twine similarly relies on an open source, robust user community. It's smaller, but the people who are dedicated to Twine, they really powered the creation of the current version of Twine, Twine 2. And there's so much that's there that's shared freely, that's built around this open source philosophy, that a truly open source platform like that really has the ability to encourage a user community. Now, Twine existed for a while before it picked off like that. It had to find some leaders, some enthusiasts who pushed it forward. And the same was kind of true for Flash, the animators who really made it popular and visible, and then the game designers who created places like Newgrounds to show off, always played a role. And that goes to the other key, open distribution outside of walled gardens. iOS, Android are never going to be these types of platforms. In order to share things, you have to be part of their walled garden, part of their economy, and you can watch your work quickly disappear because they will eliminate it if you don't continue to update and maintain it. Flash and Twine share the concept that what you create is your file that you can distribute freely and easily without reliance on a payment system or a distributor. And that is something I wish more platforms would understand and embrace. If we had a truly open alternative to Android, it wouldn't rely quite so much on their walled infrastructure and expectations.
Your talk has made me really curious about these post-election games, and I'm interested in hearing more about how they are representing race and racial issues, and particularly racial futures. Because this one example that you showed us has this very apocalyptic vision that ends in violence, and I'm wondering if there are other games that envision different futures.
There are, and I just saw a sign flash that said 1 minute, so I'm not probably going to do justice to this. But so the jam I was referencing is called Resist Jam. It came out of Indicate and had a lot of collaborators. There's a huge archive of work, and Bridget and I went through and played all of them. So there are games that are particularly just about the experience of occupying a space and being viewed with suspicion. There are mini games within that don't forefront violence in the same way as that example. And of course, they tend to be the games that came from personal creators sharing one aspect of highly situated experience rather than trying to simulate the whole kind of big challenges presented post-election. So I'd say the best games in that collection are the most personal, particularly for representing and thinking about race post-Trump.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.